Genesis chapter 39, we're reading. And verse number 20. It came to pass the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. I've got the wrong reading here. Verse 21, and Springboard will read it for you. Chapter 39. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. And whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. And the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. And it came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was wroth against two of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers. And he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in ward. And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning, and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said unto him, We've dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray you. And the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and said to him, In my dream, behold, a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, and her blossoms shot forth, and the clusters thereof brought forth ripe grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said unto him, This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thine head, and restore thee unto thy place. And thou shalt deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand after the former manner when thou wast his butler. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said unto Joseph, I also was in my dream, and behold, had 3 white baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there was all manner of baked meats for Pharaoh, and the birds did eat them out of the basket upon my head. And Joseph answered and said, This is the interpretation thereof. The 3 baskets are 3 days, and yet within 3 days shall Pharaoh lift up thy head from off thee, and shall hang thee on a tree, and the birds shall eat thy flesh from off thee. And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again. And he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet, what a yet, did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. When you know that God is preparing you for something, and you are given warning by God that He is preparing you for a new job or a new move, or for marriage, or to move to a new land, or a new commitment, when you know He is preparing you for this, then you can take quite easily the chastening of the Lord. Preparation is not so painful when you consciously choose it. What makes preparation hard is when you don't know that it is preparation, and that what is happening to you is God preparing you for something new. I'm not all that old, but I have found this much, that God never allows His children to get in a rut. You ask any shepherd and ask him if a flock of sheep were allowed to run where they wanted, what on earth would they do? They would, in fact, create gullies and create erosion, and they would wreck the environment in which they were, as far as any successful future for them was concerned. They need management. Sheep need management. I was going through Antrim yesterday, and there was a modern shepherd in front of me, an old fellow with a battered hat, and he was driving a Volvo, if I remember right, and he was driving a flock of sheep down the main highway. And there he was with his blinkers going, and my kids were in the back, and the sheep were going all over the place. And I said, well, there you are, girls. There is a modern shepherd for you. Number one, he's lazy. He won't get out and walk. Number two, his flock are in exceptional danger, and they hardly know where they're going. And number three, looking at him, he's probably more interested in money than he is in sheep. And someone sparked up, but Daddy, sheep are more important than money, aren't they? And I said, yes, they are. You see, you need someone who cares for the flock. And the Lord is leading you as His children, as His sheep, always to better things. You may have to go up through a valley, a dark valley, according to Psalm 23, to get there. But He is always leading you on to better things, always. God is not a bore. Never. God is never boring. And He's wanting to lead you to areas that you've never yet dreamt of blessing. But sometimes it's painful on the way there. You have to shed a few things. And you need to be chastened. And if God were to explain every detail and tell us that he was behind everything, then the whole ordeal would be a lot more bearable. But seldom does God explain to you what he's doing with you. It's only when it's over and you look back that you can see, yes, God was preparing me for this. How good of him that I didn't have this and I didn't have that I wanted, or whatever. It's only later, as God puts us through the test, or test after test, he puts us through it. It's only later that we see what was happening to us. That was all of his planning. But he doesn't always explain it as he leads us. He goes out before us, and we don't know where he's going, but he's always leading us to better things and higher ground and richer pasture and greater experiences and more knowledge of himself. If we are believers tonight, if you know Christ as your Savior, you're only beginning a great adventure that will never end. God has things for you that eyes have never seen and hearts have never understood, ears have never heard, prepared for those that love him. But bit by bit, he's revealing it to you in the Spirit and by the Spirit, but he's got a lot more for you. So what we see here in this story of Joseph tonight is that the smallest circumstance in my life has a meaning. And the fact is that we do not really know the profound significance of many of the simplest details in our lives. Now let's learn it, and learn it well. Nothing happens to a Christian by chance. And he's a very happy fellow or girl, man or woman, a very happy person whose eye is open to see the hand of God in everyday events. If you only think that God works on Sundays or in meetings, then you have a very narrow view of God. To that kind of person who can see God in all the details of every detail in their life, or often see God in them, not that we understand everything that's happening, that kind of person always has a joy in their life. In fact, a glory almost in their life that the person who doesn't see God in all the details of life never has. If you can't see the hand of God in your life, how mundane must your life be? And miserable must your life be. And I know there are times when God seems to hide himself and we don't understand what's happening, and that's not all entirely our fault. God has a purpose in that, as with Job. Yet at the same time, Job was able to say, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Joseph was not to know that the events that were surrounding him in prison were to have such a profound significance on his life, the life of Egypt, the life of other North African countries, and the life of his own family and his own people, all in prison. Profound significance came out of these simple details of this passage. And observe that through all of it, that lovely characteristic that Joseph had of faithfulness to duty at all times. He was always faithful to his everyday duties. If he had to clean the prison, as we see in a moment, he had to serve these two officers of Pharaoh, because the passage says that they were given Joseph. Joseph was to serve them and attend them in prison, because they were two of the top officers in the land. Even though they were in prison, they got extra special treatment, segregation if you like, because of their social position. And Joseph had to serve them. I would think carry them food, look after them, and so on. in all the details of serving in prison, in his position, and also the other prisoners being under him in this ward, he was always faithful to his duty. That actuated Joseph at all times. Is that true of us? Are we faithful in the every simple day duties, our daily duties that lie to our hand? Now, I know that his circumstances were hard. I know that his position was the result of gross injustice by an immoral woman, but that didn't make any difference to the faithfulness and loyalty with which Joseph did his duty, even though this wicked woman had destroyed his reputation. He still was faithful to his duties, whatever they were, and they must have seemed and were pretty mundane. You see, faithfulness to our duty is a very important thing. Some people think the apex of Christian service is pulpit preaching. God forbid. That is not the apex of Christian service. Some of the greatest acts done in the Church of Christ in Ulster today were probably done by people who'll never be heard of, as far as this earth's concerned. No Nobel Prize will come to them. Yet they were faithful to their duty. Even in human terms, it's true. I love this story of the bucketing wet night in a little town in the United States where there was a hotel where the old folk, man and a woman, couldn't find any rooms anywhere, and they arrived at this hotel, and the young manager of the hotel said, you can have my room. And he slept on the settee in the entrance to the hotel or whatever. And the old folk went in and slept in his room. Now what happened? Amazing thing happened. About a year later, true story, he got a round-trip ticket to the United States city of New York. And he went to New York, sent by this old man this ticket, and he went, and the old man met him at the airport and took him to a new hotel that was being built there called the Waldorf Astoria. It's a fabulous place. I've stood outside it and looked at it. I didn't go in, but I stood and looked at it and thought, wow, what a lovely hotel. Just off Fifth Avenue. And that young man, literally in there, as he went in there, this old man turned to him and said, I own this hotel. I built this hotel. I own the chain of hotels or whatever. And I was looking for a young manager to manage my new hotel. And I thought that a young fellow who would give up his room to a couple of old folk on a soaking wet night was the kind of guy that should run my hotel. Will you be my manager? Will I what? He said, and took it. You say that's a fairy tale story. Well, it's only peanuts in comparison to what will happen to you when you're faithful to the Lord. There is not a cup of cold water given in the Lord's name, and when I talk about cold water, I have to think about Joe, because he's going to get an extra reward. He not only gives a cup of cold water to me in the Lord's name, he puts orange in it as well. So there's an extra reward for that. But even a cup of cold water given in the name of a disciple is not without its reward. Jesus said so. And not that you do it for the reward. The plain fact is you will get it if it were done for him. When I was a young Christian, I remember very well learning that lovely little chorus so well known to Ulster Christians. Deeds of merit as we thought them. He will tell us were but sin, and little acts we had forgotten. He will tell us were for him. You say it again. Okay. Deeds of merit as we thought them, he will tell us were but sin, and little acts we had forgotten. He will tell us where for him. And I know it was no Waldorf Astoria that poor Joseph was in. It's called in the Authorized Version a dungeon. Probably, some commentators say, a hole in the ground. I've never seen any dungeon that was basically anything less. Of some kind. Who can tell? Tunnels, perhaps, down there. But the circumstances were hard because it would seem, and notice it was the captain of the guard that appointed Joseph to attend to these prisoners. It was the captain of the guard who did it. And the captain of the guard, according to chapter 39, was Pharaoh. So Joseph must have felt maybe a bit sore in his heart when the man who had wrongly imprisoned him because of his lying, wicked wife, he must have felt it pretty hard when Potiphar appointed him to attend to these prisoners. Verse 3, he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. Verse 3 of chapter 40. But Joseph never said a word. And Joseph's faithful loyalty to his spiritual convictions, please notice, did not stand in the way of earthly promotion in his job. He was promoted, of course. And these two very important men were put, he was to serve them. And Joseph was promoted at all levels. Notice verse 23 of chapter 39, the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did the Lord made to prosper. And according to verse number 22, all of the prisoners that were in the prison, whatever they did, Joseph was behind it. So this fellow has incredible power for a slave prisoner. Everywhere he goes and everything he touches has a Midas touch under God's power. It turns to gold, real gold, better than real gold. A man who is faithful to his duties is not unnoticed by men of the world. And fellas and girls and men and women, if in your everyday job you are faithful to the duties your boss gives you to do, whether he sees you or whether he doesn't, they are not slow to detect real character, some of them, and to take real advantage of it. Genuine loyalty to the Lord will always express itself in faithfulness to our everyday duties. And God may promote some of you here tonight to a very, very high place in your job or in your career, because you are a Christian, because your boss can trust you, because he knows that you will be faithful. I know, on the other hand, some of them, when they're up to all sorts of backhanders and tricks, they don't want a Christian coming too close, and they may try to get rid of you, and that's a real problem too. But because that happens doesn't mean to say it won't go the other way. Some can recognize gold, a golden value in a person when they see it. But this is good, this is great. But notice that at this time in Joseph's life, his gift is now put on the shelf. His gift has been held in trust. He had no chance to use his greatest gift, which was the interpretation of dreams. And in that daily grind in prison, in the routine of prison, that gift of interpreting dreams seemed far remote from the days when he told his own family that they would bow down before him one day. What about all that now? Well, it seemed to be far distant to this young man in the daily grind of prison routine. His gift that God had given him was not functioning. And maybe yours isn't. And God has gifted you. But you have so many responsibilities and other things that you can't get using it. And the daily grind is so heavy you can't get using it. Like Joseph. Look, the Bible says, do not despise the day of small things. For those small things in your life at the moment, you say, nothing big is happening to me. Nothing exciting is happening to me. No great doors of opportunity are opening for me. It is mundane, and it's daily, and it's grinding, and it's difficult, and it's narrow in its circumstance. And I know I am capable of more, but I can't get a chance to let it loose. Oh, my friend, don't despise the day of small things, for the day of small things may not appear to be so small 20 years from now. Remember that. Who would ever have thought that when Pharaoh's butler and baker committed a crime, that such a thing was going to have anything to do with a child of God? Two fellows commit a crime. From the way that the baker was hung and eventually put on a tree and the birds eat his flesh, it would seem that his crime must have been the worst. You know, these men held a very responsible position because they were in charge of all the food to see that Pharaoh wasn't poisoned and so on. And these men had a very high position in the land. But the plain fact of the matter is that whenever the chief baker was taken and put on the tree and the birds ate his flesh, that was really against Egyptian protocol and really against the way Egyptians did things, because you know they paid great attention to how a body was embalmed and what was buried with it and so on. So he must have been guilty in Pharaoh's view of something very heinous. Maybe a coup d'etat, who can tell? But when those two fellas committed that crime, whatever it was, that offended their master, who would ever have thought that God could overrule it and use it to be a blessing to a child of God? God never brings good out of evil, because there is no good in evil. But he brings good in spite of evil. And maybe somebody in your family has committed some crime. Maybe somebody in your circle has committed crime. And you say, this will drag us all down. This will ruin us. Not necessarily so. This had profound significance in the life of Joseph. You never would have imagined that these two fellows coming into the prison and being put under the care of Joseph as a servant, that as a result of them coming, Joseph would get a chance to use his flawless gift. Who would ever have thought or imagined that Joseph's gift would be used in a prison? And you say, well, God could never use me mightily where I am. How do you know? You say, God could never do great things in my circumstance. You have no idea, friend, what God could do and what he can use. Did he not use a little worm, and you're no worm, to bring a message to the prophet Jonah, that bigoted little man? God can use even a little creature like that. And you're of much greater value than many sparrows or all the animals of the world. You have a precious soul that God has saved. And your gift, you say, well, it's shelved at the moment, but how do you know one of these days, even in your circumstance that is difficult, God won't use it powerfully? Gift, whatever it is God-given. And as we discovered last week, Joseph had a great gift to interpret dreams, but at the same time he was a terrific organizer and a great administrator, and he didn't know he had that gift. And it took prison and Pharaoh's house to bring his administrative gifts out, so that he could be trained when one day God would give him the administration of the feeding of a whole nation. He who fed these 2 men every day was going to feed a nation before he was finished. I mean, the thing's fantastic. God makes no mistakes. He was training the young man in a very small place for a far greater work. You look after that little Sunday school class, my friend, and God may give you those little sheep. God may give you, like David, like he looked after his dad's sheep, a whole nation of sheep to look after before you're finished. Who can tell where some of you will go and what will become of you? That's why it's so exciting to be here tonight, to have the privilege of teaching you. Gift is God-given, so be thankful for it. But remember that conceit is self-given. So be careful. God gives you a gift, but if you and I get conceited with whatever gift God gives us, that conceit is not God-given, it's self-given, and it can ruin us. Gift is what you have, but a person is what you are, and it is the person who uses the gifts. And if the person is inadequate, then the gift won't account for much. You know, most of us look at some very unusually gifted fellow or girl or man or woman, and we assume, wow, look at that gift. Tremendous gift. And we say to ourselves, it's just gift. It's just talent. They just have it. No, but it's the person that matters. I was very kindly invited along to a dinner last week to meet the American ambassador to the United Kingdom. And someone in this class invited me to go. And Julie introduced me to the ambassador, telling him all about Tuesday night, and I nearly passed out. So I told the ambassador we'd keep him a seat any time he wanted to come. So if he's here tonight, the Lord bless you, sir. But I watched that man. Can you imagine the American ambassador in Ulster at the moment? I mean, the poor guy's like a rabbit in a minefield. Ever seen a rabbit in a minefield? And he stands up to make a speech in a very politically sensitive situation. But then I discovered that not only was he a gifted man, and he was very gifted, but there was a person behind the gift. And you know, he told a fantastic story that I'll never forget about how that he hadn't come to Ulster to give us advice on how to run the country. There were plenty who did that. He told us that he wanted to help us. And he reminded us of the fellow who fell over the cliff and was hanging on by a plant. And he shouted up and he said, "Is there anybody up there?" And a baritone voice came back and said to him, "Have faith. Have faith and you'll fall on the rocks gently. Just have faith." And the fellow looked up again and he shouted, "Is there anybody else up there?" That ambassador was making a very powerful point, that you can give advice, and yes, have faith, of course, have faith and you'll fall gently on the rocks, but are you prepared to get down and help the guy? See, there was a great ambassador, but behind it was a man who had feeling and heart and gift. And I admired his gift greatly, but I admired the person even more for the way he put it across. There are great men around, you know, and it's great to listen to them. You always hope when you listen to them, a bit of it will rub off on all of us. And you say, "Oh, but that person is very gifted." Yes, but it's not just the gift. It's not just the brain. It's the character behind the gift that makes the gift sing and powerful. Whether you be an ambassador or whether you scrub floors in prisons, all work All work is honorable. All of it. There is no work that is dishonorable if it's done for the Lord. Gift is only the beginning. A great person takes a small gift and develops it as a tool for serving others. But a small-minded person with a great gift soon fizzles out. And they're standing around wondering, why have I fizzled out? Why is my gift not being used? Because they are so narrow and small-minded and big-headed and conceited with their gift. They fizzle out. It's the person behind the gift that makes the gift so powerful. And notice how great a person Joseph was, who was bound for very high office in the government of Egypt. Notice how great a person he was. Yes, he had a great gift. Sure he did. But that's not what made him. Behind it was a heart, and behind it was a person that God was preparing. And I'm glad you've got gift or talent. That's great. But it's what you are that will make that gift useful or not useful. Who would ever have thought that when Pharaoh's, butler and baker came down into that prison, and that young fella started to serve them, they never would have thought that he was such a great person. Joseph was not only working, he was watching. Watching. I hope you're watching. He's working away for the Lord, and he's serving the Lord, and he's looking after these fellas, and he's caring for the prison, and he's in administration, and it's, I'm sure, not very exciting, but he's doing it for the Lord. And then he walks in one morning, and he looks at these two very important men, and he said, in plain Irish, "What's wrong with you today, boys? What are you looking so sad for? Why do you look so sad?" And when I was thinking about this, it's very important. Surely he was the one who should have been sad, but he wasn't. He was really saying, "Cheer up, fellas, what's wrong?" He was the one who'd been maligned. He was the one who was in there falsely accused. He was the one there sold by his family. He was the one there despised by his own. And yet there he was going around cheering everybody up. But sure, isn't that the way? Isn't that the way often? You see, even though you may be in adverse conditions, you can still encourage a person who is in even greater trouble than you are. When they put me in hospital recently, it was quite funny, really. And I was coming out of the anesthetic. What did I discover beside me but a Tuesday nighter lying in the recovery ward? And she was just coming out of the anesthetic too. And she looked at me and I looked at her. It was quite something else. And we wondered whether we were in heaven or on earth or where we were. Even before we got back into our wards, there we were coming around. But she tried to encourage me and I tried to encourage her. But you would have laughed if you'd been there. You can comfort others by the same comfort that you have been comforted of God. Has God comforted you? Of course he has. Then when you come across somebody who's in trouble, pass on the comfort. At this stage, Joseph wasn't even thinking of himself at all. But he was coming in thinking how he might cheer these two fellas up, how he might encourage them. It's lovely, isn't it? It was a great leap forward, whenever you begin to get your eye off yourself. But it's not easy. And many of God's preparations for us are simply aimed to get our eyes away from ourselves and to lead us out from that luxury we must never allow ourselves, the luxury of self-pity. Because it is a luxury. It's lovely to wallow in it. Nobody loves me, and nobody cares for me, and everybody's against me, and nobody loves me anymore. And we mightn't say it that way, but that's how we must sound at times. Everybody's against me. But it's not true, and we know it's not true, and our loved ones love us, but when we wallow in self-pity, as I have been known to do often, how dangerous it is. It's a luxury we mustn't allow ourselves. You see, a heart, as I've given you in your notes, a heart that is at leisure, point 2a, from itself can soothe and sympathize. When your heart is at leisure from yourself. You know, there was a Tuesday nighter here recently, decided that she would have a go at parachute jumping. Wonderfully exercised all our prayer lives when she went up. She never jumped before, and she did a great job of it. I wasn't there because I couldn't bear looking. But you know, I'm sure if you were talking to her tonight, and she's not a teenager either, she jumped from a great height, it must have been letting go was the hardest part. I mean, it would give me the horrors even to think about it, because I'm scared of heights. Even up here I get a bit scared. Not quite, but it must be that letting go that is the hardest part. And often in our lives that's true. We hold on to self-pity, and it's choking us. And if only we let it go, God would carry us into areas of blessing that we never thought about before. You see, a heart at leisure from itself, it soothes other people. And it can sympathize. Tell me something. Do you know many people in Ulster at the moment who are content? If you do, would you send them round for supper? Would you? You say there not be too many for supper, Derick. Yeah, that's true. Me too. Why are we so discontented? We who say we know the Lord and have trusted Him as our Savior, what's wrong? Well, we're getting very self-conscious, you see, and we're looking in. And as we look in, it really gets us down. But Joseph, in his hard circumstances, went on serving others. And I'm sure it wasn't easy. I'm sure he felt like throwing the bucket at them or whatever, many a time. I'm sure he's just as human as all the rest of us. Or whatever. But he went on, and he didn't wallow in self-pity. And I think that one of the most remarkable things in Joseph's character was the combination of two things. You must admit, folks, he had great ability, and that's very nice. But he was also a very attractive young man with his ability. And attractiveness and ability were beautifully combined in his character. Do you not find it in life so delightful when you see those personal characteristics in a person? You see, sometimes you find a person who has great ability, yet they are anything but attractive. I don't mean physically attractive. You know, girls, don't you, that a woman can be beautiful without being good-looking? You say, tell me more. That applies to men, too. The beauty, God says, not of outward adornment, but of that inner man, Peter says. That quiet spirit, meek and quiet spirit. And meekness doesn't mean weakness. The meek woman in Proverbs 31 was not weak. She was quite an astute lady when it came to business and buying fields and caring for her husband and so on. She had got class, and a lot of class. But she had that quiet spirit in her work which was so attractive. She had great ability. But she had that within her of spirit, which is such a great thing, because youth and beauty pass away, as you would know looking at me. And they pass away quickly. But that lovely quiet spirit of submission to God and so on A woman who fears the Lord, beauty is vain, but a woman that fears the Lord, she shall be praised. She had great ability, but she was also attractive. And I think this is lovely in Joseph. Brilliant man, but very attractive in his personality and characteristics. See, many a time you find this ability without attractiveness. You know, people admire someone who has great ability. You can't help it. Say, wow, what a gift. What a great pianist, or what a great painter, or what a great whatever. Great ability. People might admire them, and they might even respect them, but very often people who have great ability are feared. People are dead scared of them. They wouldn't go in, as we say in Ulster, a 40-foot pole. They'd be scared of them. They keep them at a distance. They've got great ability, but they're cold and unattractive. You wouldn't want to sit by the fire with them. I mean, we know that Hitler had great ability. Of that there was no doubt. But you know what one of his chief men said? He said you couldn't even enjoy eating cherries with him. I noted that down one day. What a wicked man, but a man of ability. But even his own men couldn't even enjoy eating with him. How unattractive, selfish and self-centered and egomaniac. Oh, let's not get like that. I always remember James Galway say, when he was interviewed in Geneva, when a motorbike had come and hit him and knocked him down, and he was lying in, I was going to say prison, he was lying in hospital, and somebody from Ulster, Radio Ulster, went to interview him and said, how are you getting on, James? And he said, well, he said, I'm lying here, he says, and I'm thinking about life, he says, and I'm trying to get my priorities right. I think the man was nearly killed in the accident. He was lying there. He said, you know, I had a problem. He said, I was beginning to believe what the posters said about me. Good quote, that. And here is Joseph with great ability, but there's no conceit. He's so attractive. And then, of course, you get people who are very agreeable. Oh, they get on with everybody. They're terrific. Hail fellow well met and slap you on the back and buy you a coffee any time. And terrific. Agreeable. Very attractive and agreeable. But they haven't got ability. They're without ability, which gives a man an attractiveness for a while. Yes, or a woman attractiveness. But if you just have, you're agreeable with everybody, but there isn't that ability within, then of course you'll become superficial. And people eventually, at length, it becomes evident that their amiability will count for very little, because people want to be earnest and serious, and they're amiable. Oh yes, they're amiable all the time, but there's no serious dedication to anything in their lives. And even to the Lord and His work. So to have both combined in a person, if you have both, says Griffith Thomas, ability and attractiveness combined, you have a person of real power whose influence for good can scarcely be limited. Someone with a gift who's not conceited and accepts it as from the Lord and is winsome with it, and is approachable with it, and compassionate with it, not using it to build an empire for themselves and cutting off everybody around them who threatens their gift. If you have a gift, you'll not be threatened by anybody. When God opens a door, no man can shut it. You've nothing to worry about. You just go ahead with your gift and let them do whatever they like around you. Just trust the Lord and go on. And don't get nasty and self-protective and sort of wear armor every day up and down the street and don't you come near my gift now and steal it away. Joseph's ability but attractiveness were beautifully blended. Now, Christians, try to be like that. If God has given you a gift, let the Lord add to your character those lovely characteristics of gentleness and goodness and faith and meekness and temperance. Against such there's no law. There's no law against being kind. There's no law against being gentle. There's no law against being good. Let the fruits of the Spirit of God in your life flow out, and don't hinder them, because the Spirit of God is easily grieved. And when they're combined, the sky's the limit for blessing. You think this doesn't talk to me? It talks to me just like it talks to you. Let's have, with the help of the Spirit of God, these characteristics in our lives. Now, Joseph's readiness in approaching Pharaoh's two officers is a very striking illustration of the need of faithfulness in little things. He didn't wait for some great occasion and say, when the great occasion comes, then I'll use my gift. And when the great occasion comes, then I shall shine. But at the moment, I'm going to shut up shop for a while. No. As I have said down there at the bottom of your note sheet, instead of waiting for great occasions, why not make every occasion great? If your little one bombs in from school and chucks the old school bag in the corner, why not make her day by having a chocolate bar ready for her, or a run in the car, or something that's different? Instead of, you better do your homework now. And don't you dare do this, that, and the other. I mean, just give them that every day, and is it any wonder they won't love you? You know, be firm, but be winsome. You know, the canteen lady there at university, you know, do you ever say, hey, those are lovely Brussels sprouts? She'd probably faint. Go up to the cashier, maybe a lady, maybe 60 years of age, and say, hey, that hairdo's looking well. She'll probably faint too. They usually say to me, yours isn't looking so good, but nevertheless. Whatever. Brighten their day. A little word of encouragement to the taxi man, to the bus man, to your teacher, to your professor. Why not walk up after a lecture and say, thank you very much, sir, that was very useful. He'll look at you and say, pleased to meet you, what's your name? Doesn't meet too many. Like the doctor. Oh, the doctor's a terrific guy when you're sick, but if you meet him on the street when you're well, you'd hardly even say hello. It's important we get this into our lives. Little things. He didn't wait for a great occasion to come when he would be kind and nice and courteous and cheerful. He made every occasion great. So go to your Sunday school class and make every Sunday great. Make every meal you prepare with that parsley on top. Yeah? Just put it on there. It'll not do anybody any harm, especially when I come to your house, because I love parsley. But the fact is, it makes a difference. If you're writing a letter, make it a great letter. Don't just, oh, I have to write letters, I hate writing letters. You know, whatever. Sit down for a minute and think about it. That line could change a person's life. Make every occasion great. And you'll suddenly discover that life has a meaning. Don't just treat it as a Bible class. Treat it as a milestone in people's lives that they'll never forget. A moment they'll look back to when God spoke. This is our opportunity as believers. Here he is, making prison life great. That's a lovely characteristic. You know, true life will always strive to be at its best, and that's the way we can have it at its best. Faithful in the pathway of everyday service. Everyday service. And when Joseph saw that the two men were troubled and heard that each had a dream, and they said, we've had a dream, that's why we're sad. Suddenly, like a flash, Joseph's into it, and he says, well, that's my cue to bring God into the picture. He got his opportunity. God brought it along. When those two fellows arrived in prison, he didn't walk up and say, hey, do you know who I am? I'm Joseph, you know, I've got a great gift. I can interpret dreams, and I'm down here, you know, because God has sent me, etc., etc. No, he waited until there was the proper time to do so. Sometimes we can be rude, even in our witnessing. We got to be so careful when we witness to others about the Lord, how we approach it. Jesus approached different people in a very different way. He didn't come to them all the same way and preach the message all the same way. He used one approach with the woman at the well. He used another approach with other people, with Nicodemus. But, he didn't talk to the woman at the well about the new birth. He talked to her about water. That's the only thing they really had in common at that time. And from that, he led her to himself. Tact and wisdom. He waits his chance. And the gift's been there for maybe quite a long time. And suddenly, there's his chance. God opens the door, and in he goes. He says, do you fellas not know that interpretations belong to God? Oh. But you notice he didn't give them the whole load. He didn't give them an exposition in all of doctrine. He just mentioned the Lord. His minister was preaching once. Only one fella turned up. And he went over to him. He said, "You're the only one here. I was expecting many, but there's only one here. Do you mind if I preach the whole thing? Preach the message?" He says, "Go ahead, sir. Preach, and I'll listen to it." And he sat at the back, and the preacher preached away for quite a long time, just like me. And he was preaching and preaching and preaching. And then after it was all over, this fellow was there. And he went up to him. He said, "Well, how did it go?" He said, "Look, sir," he said, "I'm no preacher." He said, "I'm a farmer." But he said, "If I was taking a load of hay," he said, "to my cattle, and only one lonely critter turned up, I sure wouldn't dump the whole lot on him." Yeah? Interpretations belong to God. That's all he said. Didn't need this anymore. When Charles Colson walked into a room after being Nixon's hatchet man, far from God, one of the foulest-mouthed individuals in the 20th century, as Watergate tapes will prove. And he looked at this fellow sitting at the other side of the desk, and he said, "There's something different about you. You're different." He said, "Yes." He said, "I've accepted Jesus as my Savior. I'm a Christian." That's all he said. And Colson went away, but it was an arrow to his heart, and it led him to Christ. Interpretations belong to God. And Joseph reasoned that if two men were badly troubled by dreams in the same night, there must be a coincidence. God must be at work. And God was the source of the dream. But notice that his servant was the channel of the interpretation. God still needs human interpreters for his messages. And God has a great message for Ulster at the moment, the message of the gospel, but to you and I is given the opportunity of bringing it to the people. And I hope they're not shouting, hanging on to the plant, "Is there anybody else up there?" He or she will doubtless be necessary until the end of time. God has no hands but our hands to do his work today. "Mine are the hands to do thy work. My feet shall run for thee. My lips shall spread the glorious news. Lord," says the Christian, "here am I, use me." God, of course, in those days communicated through dreams. Now we have the Scriptures. And it would seem to me that that doesn't mean that God can't give a dream significance, for he can. Excuse the eye, but I was preaching here and broadcasting not all that long ago one Sunday morning on the BBC. And I put in a little line in the script of the message which said, the great Samuel Rutherford said, "If a man is drowning and he throws himself on a rock, that's no shame. And if it's no shame for a drowning man to throw himself on a rock, it's no shame for a lost soul to throw themselves on Christ." And if you're lost tonight and you don't know the Savior, repent and trust him this very moment, my friend, and he'll receive you and forgive you, and his precious blood shed at Calvary will cleanse you, and you'll be born again and set right for heaven. Throw yourself upon Christ, the Rock of Ages, tonight. And I thought when I put it in, well, that probably sounds a bit archaic. That's old-fashioned language there, but I love it. There's something in that illustration. An old man was listening, very hard against the gospel all his life, as I understand it. And he heard that wee phrase, "No shame for a drowning man to throw himself on a rock." And what happened? That night he went to bed and he dreamt that he was drowning. And he woke up out of his dream, true story, woke up out of his dream, and he said, "It's time I was saved, time I knew the Lord." He went to some gospel meetings, and through the faithful preaching of the gospel, he was converted. And then he asked to be baptized. And they baptized him just a few months ago. And when he came up out of the waters of baptism, he sat down on a seat immediately and died. And I was at his funeral service not very long ago. God can use a dream. Of course he can. Do you realize, and I don't wish to be funny here, but it's true. You're so quick on the tick up, I've got to watch it. The fact is, if you eat prawns, you'll have bad dreams. You try it and see what happens. It can affect you. Even what you eat can give you dreams. And there are Christians who take their dreams so seriously that the devil can get in and control their whole day or their immediate future by a dream that they thought was from God. And maybe it's just because of what they've eaten. You know, what you eat can determine what you dream. But the devil can come in and make you think that everything you dream has godly significance. And that's not necessarily so. So don't get into this whole weird world of, I had a horrible dream last night, and be held by that all day and say, what's going to happen, what's going to happen? That's not the liberty of the children of God. Test everything that you have by the Word of God. And don't get into a crazy, weird world that God wouldn't have you in. In these days, God uses dreams. There isn't a written Word of God there. We have it now, and God particularly guides us through it. And Joseph saw the meaning of the dream in a flash. The Spirit of God told him the 3 branches were 3 days. And Joseph put himself on the line immediately. This is the interpretation, verse 12. Just like a shot, in 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your place, and you'll deliver Pharaoh's cup into his hand. That was pretty quick, wasn't it? If he had said 3 years, that would have been a long time, but he said that would have given him plenty of time, wouldn't it? To change his mind, but there's none of that dilly-dallying. He was not only right, he was exactly right. You're going to be restored in 3 days to your former position. And he knew that he was exactly right because the Lord had given to him. That was his gift. It was a flawless gift. What a place for it to be exercised. But then how honorable he was. You know, he handled himself perfectly, didn't he? So well did Joseph handle himself before Potiphar's wife in prison. What courage he had, what integrity he had, what fidelity he had. We would say, right, great. He's interpreted this butler's dream. He's ready to be used of God now. That's what you and I would think. At last, the prison doors will open. His gift will come out. He'll go right to the top. God's ways are not our ways. Not so fast. And here I must tread very carefully because I want to rightly divide the word of truth. You would say, surely here is a man who has passed the test. R.T. Kendall, in his book, God Meant It for Good, has made me really think about this verse. Others would disagree with him and take another line. But I think there is something in what R.T. says. He points out that he wasn't exactly ready yet. You would say, why couldn't he be exalted right now and get the 11 brothers into Egypt? Why couldn't God get on with it? Because he needed to learn some more. Joseph wasn't ready. A very important part of Joseph's preparation was for him to be delivered, yes, from self-pity, yes, from any self-righteousness, but he needed, and this is the hard bit, he needed to be like you and I need to be, delivered from trying to manipulate our future. Hundreds of you tonight are right here with me in this, aren't you? He with courage interpreted both dreams, and he of course told the chief baker just as faithfully as he had told the chief butler the interpretation of his dream, even though it meant predicting and saying firmly the death of the chief baker. He was faithful. But you will notice tucked in there in verse number 13, after he had interpreted the dream of the butler, he said, Butler, just a wee moment. Think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me, please, please, Mr. Butler, bring me out of this house. What's this? Let's tread carefully. I know it's right at times when you're in a corner to ask for help. I mean, after all, Elijah, when, the old raven came over the top and dropped him meat, he was the only waiter with black tails in the Bible. He dropped him. That's good. You're still alive. Good. He dropped him meat, and that was terrific. But remember, the brook dried up, and he didn't have the meat anymore. The raven stopped coming. Then God said he was to go to the widow of Zarephath and ask her for what she was having, that he might have it, even though it was the last that she had to eat. He was told by God to ask. There are times when it's good to ask for help. But it seems the more you look at it and think about it, you may not agree with this, but I'm suggesting it. God certainly could have let the butler be the way that Joseph would get out of prison at that time. But surely God wanted to teach Joseph, like he always wants to teach you and me, that he can do mighty things without our help. Oh, I know the worldling says, God helps those who help themselves. And boy, do they help themselves. And what a mess they make of it. But we're talking about a young man in training now for one of the very highest offices any believer has ever held with such dignity. And God is teaching him. God is teaching him. And the more I've thought about it, the more I can see that the initiative that eventually got him out of prison, as we'll see later in our studies, the initiative that got him out of the prison came from God through Pharaoh to the butler to Joseph. It did not come from the butler to Pharaoh to Joseph. The butler was restored to his job, yes, but Joseph was to be in prison for 2 more years. He forgot about him. God was determined to show Joseph that he could exalt him to the throne by his power alone. And God can do that for you, fellas and girls and men and women. You don't need to connive or say, speak a wee word for me, would you? Please plead on my behalf. Unless the Lord asks you to do that. Now, the Bible doesn't condemn him for what he did. And in his circumstances, of course, that was quite reasonable. But the plain fact is, that was not the way it came. How many of us really believe that God can do it without other people's power and help? God wants to put you and I in a particular place, he can do it, but if all the time we're pulling strings and we're trying to manipulate things and we won't let the Lord arrange things, he may have to keep us in chastening for a while longer. And some people are forever pulling strings. And then, of course, he defends himself. He says, I'm in here and I haven't done anything. I'm innocent. I don't deserve to be here. But the kind of work that God had in mind for Joseph, that Joseph had to be devoid of, was that he had to be devoid of defending himself. We learned last week that Joseph was never vindicated before the nation of the slur in his character. The people who have vindicated him has been us. We who read the Bible see that he was innocent, but it was never shown to the nation. He never got a chance to publicly defend himself that we read of. And he had to be free to be a great man in God's hand of any tendency to manipulate. Yes, the Lord's helping me, but that's the man there I think could help me. That's the woman there I think could help me. And they could turn out to be a disaster, just like the butler did. Don't lay your future entirely by trusting, says the Bible, in princes. Put not your trust in princes. Put not your trust in great men or men in great positions to get you out of the situation you're in. 2 more years for Joseph. You might say the poor fella couldn't take much more, yet the trial was intensified. He could have said, I'm stopping, Lord, I can't go on, I can't take any more. God says, you can, Joseph, and you must. And there's a hint here that he was trying to nudge the hand of providence. We all do that. We don't only try to nudge it, we try to shove it. He still wasn't ready. Now, let's not go too far in our imagination, but it would be worth just dwelling on the day the prison doors were opened and the butler was allowed to go free, because we may picture him saying farewell to Joseph with an assuring look and an encouraging word and maybe the old wink of the eye. I'll never forget you, son. Thanks for getting me this job. Fantastic. That's the NIV, the Northern Ireland version. But it seems to me that look was in his eye. I'll never forget you, Joseph. Of course I'll speak to Pharaoh for you, of course, telling him he would not be forgotten. And then the doors close and Joseph waits and waits and waits and waits and waits and waits. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. How deep must Joseph's humiliation have been? But oh, what Joseph must have learned in those 2 years. Hey? As he waited. Oh, the foundation of his young life must have gone deeper so that the building of his life could go higher. So that when he was lifted to the very highest position in the land for any person under Pharaoh to be lifted, when he was lifted high, 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 he knew who put him there and who had brought him there. So he didn't get carried away. He gave God all the glory. But you see, I spoke to a guy I knew, and he spoke to a man who, or a woman who danced with the Prince of Wales. You know the old story? I danced with a man who had a woman who had danced with the Prince of Wales, which is an old 1930 statement for name dropping. Well, I didn't actually do it myself, but I knew somebody whose granny who knew Lloyd George or my father or whatever. Yeah. Claiming kinship in the hour of power, so to speak. It's dangerous. Dangerous. And I think what this lovely young man learned, and I don't think he sinned, no way. But I think it's in there. The second 2 years, or these 2 years before he's exalted, this waiting time, taught Joseph the lesson that I find the hardest of all maybe to learn. That far more satisfying than the recognition of men or women for what you're doing for the Lord or whatever, is the consciousness that you are doing the will of God. Whether you're washing dishes to God's glory, whether you are making dishes in a factory to God's glory, or whatever, that you know in your heart that the work you are doing, no matter how obscure or hard or far from the fast lane of the 20th century it may appear to be, that you are there in the will of God and you're doing it as unto him. That is where true joy lies. To be in the center of God's will. And you don't need to pull any strings, because if you have God's recognition, God can one of these days lift you and carry you up through the ranks and higher even in your job and in your influence and in your position than you ever dreamt. And the guys that you thought would be good to know and the people you thought would be useful to know turn out just like to be like the chief butler. They will forget you. When they are exalted, it'll go to their heads and they will forget you. But God won't. And waiting for God is the hardest thing of all in the Christian life. It is. Waiting for God to move is the hardest thing of all. To serve him, great. Busy in prison, yes. But to wait for him. In an area of England famous for coal, there was a lovely little white flower was growing. And there was coal dust and everything, and the fella said to the fella beside in the garden, he said, why is it that that white flower hasn't got the coal dust on it that all the other flowers and all the buildings around here have? Well, he said, test it. And the fella took up a handful of dust and he threw it against the white flower, and the dust just fell off. He said, you see that white flower? He said, there's a kind of enamel almost that is over it. And no matter what dust comes upon it, coal dust or whatever, it just takes it and it casts it off and it remains white. And Joseph was that white flower. God's way is wisest. God's time is best. God's grace is sufficient. And next week we'll see how. Shall we pray?